for this symposium. We're going to have two panels, and the organization has been changed slightly. We're going to do what was labeled as the second panel first. The second panel was the panel on the rule of law. And we will then do the panel on foreign policy and domestic politics second. So if that confuses anyone, if it's confused me, I apologize. Before we begin, our keynote speaker is Lev Ponomaryov, who is familiar to many of you. He was one of the founders of Memorial, and he served twice in the Russian parliament, both in the parliament of the RSFSR before the Soviet Union fell, and in the first parliament of the new post-Soviet Russian state. He was one of the founders of the Memorial Society, and he is the leader of the movement for human rights in Russia today. He is an active defender of the rights of Russia's persecuted nationalities and underprivileged citizens. This is a role that he's played in defense of human rights and the rule of law for many, many years, because I've known him for many, many years, and I first met him in that capacity. And he is going to speak to us about the situation of human rights in Russia today, and as the French say, faute de mieux, I will translate his speech. So, Lev, without any further delay, would you like to speak? And I will translate for you. The only thing we're going to check is to make sure that this microphone, the other microphones work. Lev,
Я здесь посижу и перевожу.
Вы будете переводить?
Да, я.
Okay, hello? That works? Okay, great.
Ilan, we're going to put your name tag over to one side so no one gets confused for the moment.
Здравствуйте. Для меня большая честь выступить в этом институте перед такой профессиональной и многочисленной аудиторией.
It's a great honor for me to speak before this professional and populous audience.
Сначала я все-таки еще дополнительно представлюсь, чтобы понимать, чем я занимаюсь.
I would like to again introduce myself so you'll have a better idea what I deal with.
Я являюсь руководителем крупнейшего в России правозащитного движения, который представлен в регионах России, так сказать. И в этом главное отличие нашей организации. В большинстве регионов есть небольшие группы правозащитников, иногда даже значительные, которые занимаются защитой прав человека в данном регионе. И когда они не справляют свои задачи, они обращаются в мой центральный офис, и поэтому я как бы щупаю ситуацию с правами человека по всей стране, так сказать. И из центрального офиса помогаю решать им те проблемы, которые они не могут решить сами.
I want to explain that our organization has contacts with regional groups which defend human rights all over the country, and when those groups aren't able to resolve certain problems on their own, they refer to us. In this respect, our movement differs from various others.
И это касается, одним словом, судьб отдельных людей. То есть вот мы персонально помогаем людям, персонально по всей стране. Но второй аспект нашей работы заключается в том, что, понимая, что эти проблемы не могут быть решены в рамках того режима, затруднены в решениях, то есть иногда они просто не решаются. Мы выходим на уровень политический.
Okay, Lev, we deal with personal problems, we defend individuals, but when, insofar as it becomes clear oftentimes that those individual problems can't be resolved in the existing situation, we move on to a political level. We carry our activities to a political level.
И поэтому я являюсь инициатором создания с сентября прошлого года правозащитного совета России. Туда вошли основные лидеры правозащитного движения.
As a result, I became the initiator of the Human Rights Council of Russia, in which participate various activists from other parts of the country.
И эта структура не формализованная, она носит название «Правозащитный совет России». Туда вошли Алексеева, председатель Хельсинской группы, Ковалев Сергей, мемориал, там Олег Орлов тоже из мемориала, ну и ряд других, в общем, 10 человек, которые Ганушкина, которые тоже наиболее известные правозащитники.
This council it comprises some of the better known human rights defenders in Russia today: Lyudmila Alexeyeva, Oleg Orlov from Memorial, Svetlana Ganushkina, и кто еще? Sergei Kovalyov was an associate of Sakharov's, and various other people who are known both in the country and abroad.
И мы заявили, что для того, чтобы решать проблемы прав человека, мы вынуждены, вот мы, правозащитники, вынуждены заниматься политикой. Но не партийной политикой, когда люди говорят, что мы должны власть в стране, взять власть в стране, так сказать, это делает партии. А мы говорим, что мы занимаемся политикой для того, чтобы изменить ситуацию в области прав человека, но не претендуем на власть.
We understand, and we understood that in order to change the political situation in Russia, we have to deal with politics, not in the sense of party politics, such as we want to seize power, but we want to change the political situation in the country so that people's rights are defended.
И поэтому я вот ставлю перед собой две цели. С одной стороны, коротко объяснить ситуацию с правами человека в России, но я при этом знаю, что вы ее знаете, наверное, не хуже меня, так сказать, и в большей степени говорить о наших последних инициативах, так сказать, то есть инициативах правозащитников в политической сфере, скажем так.
So I would like to explain the situation of human rights in Russia, although I know that many of you understand it no worse than I do, and also discuss some of the initiatives which we plan to undertake.
И, по-видимому, у меня полчаса, вот я уже 5 минут говорю, я, наверное, должен оставить время минут 10 на ответ на вопросы, да?
Да, я думаю, да. You will leave about 10 minutes for questions and answers.
Я сейчас 15 минут говорю, а потом 10 минут на ответы. Так, да? Примерно. Теперь ситуация в области прав человека. Я привез с собой докладики небольшие на английском языке, которые касаются ситуации в области прав человека, значит, в судебной системе, реформа милиции, так сказать, тоже, в правоохранительной системе, и в области пенитенциарной, там даже 2 доклада пенитенциарной, ситуация в пенитенциарной системе. И фактически это охватывает вот ту, так сказать, часть, которой можно более подробно познакомиться с этими докладами, которые, видимо, будут размножены.
I've brought with me reports on the situation in the penitentiary system, the system of justice, and various other aspects of the legal system in Russia. These are going to be reproduced. You'll be able to get copies if they are of interest to you after the conference.
Начнем, может быть, с наиболее важной, это судебная система, потому что, в конце концов, любой конфликт, который возникает в обществе или между гражданином и властью, он все равно должен завершиться судебным вердиктом.
I'll begin with the judicial system, because after all, any conflict involving the individual and society should end with a judicial decision.
Да, и вот, может быть, еще вводные слова, я должен сказать, что, как ни странно, вот все проблемы в области прав человека, то есть кризис в области прав человека освещается, то есть само состояние кризиса освещается в прессе в российской довольно широко, не только в оппозиционной прессе, не только в интернете, но и даже в официальной. Более того, официальная власть там, в лице президента Медведева неоднократно говорила о кризисе, так сказать, в каком-то смысле, вот те слова, которые я говорю, я часто очень могу цитировать Медведева.
Okay, so the problem of human rights is actually covered widely, not only in the opposition press, but in the official press. And it's discussed by political figures. Many of the things that I say are said as well by President Medvedev.
И это лишний раз говорит о кризисе, потому что и беспомощности той политической системы, которая вынуждена признавать
and that speaks again for the crisis of the system and its helplessness.
Дай мне короткий, чтобы я могу...
Окей.
Да.
Я пытаюсь тоже завершить мысль.
Да, чтобы...
Начнем, вот возвращаясь к судебной системе. Именно о кризисе судебной системы неоднократно говорил Медведев. Но что, вот обращу внимание некое, которое, может быть, прошло мимо вашего внимания.
The crisis of the judicial system has been described by Medvedev, but there's an aspect of it which may have escaped your attention.
Когда президент Медведев был кандидатом, он говорил, что верховенство права для него главное.
When Medvedev was a candidate, he said that the supremacy of law was for him the most important thing.
Однако практически первым крупным шагом президента Медведева в конце первого года его президентства
But the most important step of Medvedev after the first year of his presidency
было подписание закона, по которому все уголовные дела, которые были подследственны ФСБ,
was the signing of a law according to which all cases being investigated under the authority of the FSB
были лишены возможности рассматриваться в судах присяжными.
Were deprived of the possibility of being examined by a jury in a jury trial.
Я думаю, что трудно. Это крупнейшее поражение юриста Медведева, крупнейшее, потому что суды присяжных – это локомотив судебной реформы в России. Это наиболее справедливый суд.
This is of course a great failure of Medvedev because the trial by jury would be the locomotive of judicial reform in Russia.
Суды присяжных дают примерно 20-25, от 15 до 25% оправданий. Это соответствует международной норме, которая существует.
In a jury trial, there are 20 to 25% acquittals, which corresponds to international norms.
Это значит, что после такого решения следователи ФСБ могут творить любое беззаконие и все равно будут осуждены.
As a result of this decision of Medvedev's, this ruling of Medvedev's, an investigator for the FSB can carry out any kind of illegality and still be protected.
Обращаю ваше внимание, что оправдательные, профессиональные судьи оправдывают только 0,4%.
Whereas the acquittal rate in the courts where there is no jury is only 0.4. It's not less. It's 0.4%, less than 1%.
То есть трудно даже произнести, настолько это неправдоподобно. На самом деле, значит, в 20-30 раз у нас чаще бывают обвинительные приговоры в судах, чем вообще в цивилизованном мире.
20 or 30 times more frequent are guilty verdicts in Russian courts than anywhere in the civilized world.
Поэтому это главная особенность нашей судебной системы, что она репрессивная.
The principal characteristic of the judicial system in Russia is that it's repressive.
И таким образом можно сказать, по оценкам и независимых, и правозащитников, и, так сказать, может быть, даже ближе к системе аналитиков, в наших колониях, там, в тюрьмах находится от 30 до 50% либо невиновных людей, либо заслуживающих значительно более мягкого наказания.
We can estimate that in the prisons and camps of Russia, as many as 30% of the inmates may either be innocent or deserving of a less severe sentence.
И судами бесспорно манипулирует как власть, и наиболее, так сказать, известный процесс Ходорковского-Лебедева, который вам хорошо известен, когда идет прямой политический заказ.
The authorities manipulate the courts, as in the case of Khodorkovsky and Lebedev, where what was at stake was a direct order.
И власти на местах, там губернаторы и так далее, и захватывается, и есть...
The same applies for local authorities, governors, and so on.
И в массовом порядке происходит рейдерский захват бизнеса через судебные решения, и таких сотни и сотни дел, которые выходят в том числе и на правозащитников.
The businesses are being seized with the help of false judicial decisions in raiding, in instances of what is called raiding in Russia, corporate raiding, although in Russia it has a completely different meaning.
И вот главное все-таки, еще раз почему, потому что заранее известно, что всего лишь 0,4% будет оправдание. То есть если дело поступает в суд, то не надо ничего доказывать. Вероятность того, что будет человек оправдан, уже заранее всем известно, будет 0,4%. Понимаете, в чем проблема?
Everything operates on the fact that the acquittal rate is so low that if somebody is brought to court, the chances of him escaping conviction are it's only 0.4%. It's extremely low.
Поэтому вот я хочу подчеркнуть, что даже не надо давление оказывать на судью. Вот лишь бы довести до суда. Вот в чем. Вот лишь бы довести до суда. Все, считайте, что человека посадят.
You don't even have to put pressure on the judges. Just bring the person to court, and you can count on a conviction.
Поэтому главная проблема сейчас стоит в том, чтобы изменить репрессивный характер судебного процесса, чтобы вернуть, наоборот, как можно больше судам присяжных дел, расширить вот суды присяжных.
So now the task is to change the repressive character of the judicial system, and to the extent possible to expand the role of trial by jury.
И я должен сказать, что Медведев об этом тоже говорит, как ни странно. Вот могильщик, с одной стороны, могильщик судов присяжных по делам терроризма, он сейчас в последнее время очень много, и сделал довольно много, чтобы люди, и вот последнее, я на этом заканчиваю, так сказать, вот эту тему с судебной системой, Медведев довольно много сделал в этом направлении, сейчас скажу в чем.
But ironically, Medvedev talks about this, and at least in words he supports it. He supports the idea of increasing the role of jury trials. And in fact, he's even done certain things.
А именно, он уже провел и выступил с инициативой, провел через Государственную Думу закон о том, чтобы не брать под стражу людей по экономическим преступлениям. Я должен сказать, это очень большой тоже успех, и за это надо благодарить Медведева, потому что сотни людей, если они до суда не находятся под стражей, то вероятность того, что они будут оправданы, намного больше. Потому что судьи пользуются правилом. Если он уже сидит до суда, значит, он должен дальше сидеть. Это опять правило.
So Medvedev has introduced proposal, has proposed that people who are not chronic offenders, that they will not be held in custody up until trial, because the fact that a person is in custody at the time that he's tried greatly increases in the Russian context the likelihood that he will be convicted.
Теперь о реформе правоохранительной системы я хотел несколько слов сказать.
Now about the reform of the law enforcement.
Я и другие правозащитники, мы резкие критики той реформы, которая идет, в том виде, в котором она уже произошла, можно сказать.
I and other human rights defenders are extremely critical of those reforms that have been carried out so far, and the way in which they're carried out.
И главное, так сказать, в чем мы видим проблему? В том, что реформа правоохранительной системы происходит теми же людьми, которые довели эту правоохранительную систему до полного кризиса.
The reform of the law enforcement in Russia is carried out by the same people who led that law enforcement to complete crisis.
То есть реформа происходит тем же министром внутренних дел, тем же окружением министра внутренних дел, его заместителями, которые последние 7 лет руководили этой системой. Возникает вопрос, а какая, вот, допустим, кадровая реформа может ли быть справедливой?
Well, what kind of personnel reforms can be just under circumstances in which reforms are carried out by the people who were responsible for the previous abuses?
Совершенно очевидно, что МВД коррупционно было снизу доверху.
It's clear to everyone that the Ministry of Internal Affairs was corrupt from top to bottom.
И поэтому, сохраняя руководство и сокращая, так сказать, других милиционеров, сохраняет коррупционные вертикали, все коррупционные вертикали, наиболее как бы близкие к руководству, там, к Путину, допустим, скорее всего, потому что он создавал все эти коррупционные вертикали при его правлении. Но при этом сокращение идут как раз тех людей, которые критиковали.
So what's going on is the preservation of the entire corrupt vertical hierarchy created by Putin, whereas those who were critical are being removed. Those who are critical and independent-minded are being removed from the law enforcement organs.
И возникает вопрос, а зачем это нужно, допустим, президенту Медведеву? Но, видимо, здесь вот в чем причина. И мы требовали снять министра внутренних дел, после этого начинать реформу. Вот главное условие было.
We demanded that you remove the Minister of Internal Affairs and then begin reforms. That was the important thing.
И есть публичные люди, которые, конечно, не из оппозиции, а прямо из близких к власти люди, которые, такие, как, допустим, Геннадий Гудков. Он из «Справедливой России», он очень резко критиковал ситуацию, и наверняка, если бы такой публичный человек был министром внутренних дел, он бы сохранял не только риторику, но и что-то делал.
Well, there are people in the government, Gennady Gudkov, for example, who's close to the president, who have criticized the situation in the law enforcement organs. Perhaps if someone like that became the minister, it would be possible to expect real reforms.
Но они боятся тронуть МВД, так сказать, и сохраняют ее в том виде, который есть, потому что министр внутренних дел Нургалиев, он говорит о том, что если вы как-то растревожите вот наше министерство, то тогда мы не будем вас защищать, когда народ выйдет на улицы. Вот главная причина.
But they're afraid to touch the Ministry of Internal Affairs, because the minister Nurgaliev says that if you're going to start interfering with us, then we won't defend you when the people take to the streets.
Но я должен сказать, что надежда оппозиции заключается в том, что при такой коррупции, при таком уровне, что себя представляет милиция, их тоже защищать никто не будет, по-моему.
But the position of the human rights defenders, the opposition, is that given the level of corruption in the Ministry of Internal Affairs, they're not going to defend you anyway.
Но это тот тупик, в который любой репрессивный режим все равно входит. Вот если понаблюдать исторически, так всегда бывает. Это тупик.
This is the kind of dead end in which any repressive regime ends up, where any such regime ends up.
Ну, наверное, милиции все. И последнее, я вот хочу сказать о пенитенциарной системе.
And now, finally, I'd like to speak about the system of pensions.
Наша организация, и я должен сказать, что для правозащитников тема пенитенциарной системы является очень важной. Почему в России? Потому что там убивают людей, а право на жизнь – это самое главное.
This is a critical question because we're talking about the lives of people. Here people are actually really killed, and human life is the most important.
И можно понять, вот если на свободе, да, вот по нашу сторону решетки, вся коррупция огромная, да, огромное бесправие, то можно себе представить, что происходит по ту сторону решетки.
Listen, I made a mistake. I mistranslated. We're talking about, Lev is talking about the prison system, not the pension system, which I misheard. The prison system, and you can imagine, and I apologize for that. And he says if there are abuses that affect people who live in freedom, you can imagine what goes on the other side of the barbed wire, where it's a question of life and death. Okay.
Вот в России около 900 пенитенциарных учреждений. Это колонии, тюрьмы и СИЗО. Этот СИЗО это до суда, как бы, люди где находятся.
Yeah, in Russia there are various types of prison institutions. There are labor camps, SIZO, which is Следственный, investigative isolator, and prisons.
Я сразу хочу сказать, что в большинстве систем там ситуация там, более-менее, скажем так, жалобы на условия содержания, на медицину, на там коррупцию, на голод, это все везде есть, но людей не убивают в большинстве.
In most of the prisons, there are certain standard complaints that exist everywhere about food conditions, but people aren't actually killed.
Но существует десятки, подчеркиваю, десятки, это 30-40, может быть, колоний.
But there are about 30 or 40 colonies
и СИЗО.
And investigative isolators. Когда мы говорим колонии, это лагерь.
Тюрьмы. Ну, у вас нет колонии, но у нас тюрьмы. В общем, тюрьмы.
Ну, и лагеры, да?
Да, лагерь.
Yeah, labor camps and investigative isolators. There are about 30 or 40 of them.
Которые мы называем пыточные зоны.
Which we call torture zones.
Я совершенно с полной ответственностью говорю, что там это настоящие концлагеря.
Which can be described completely as just absolute concentration camps.
Где оперативники, вот милиция, следственные органы выбивают из сидящих там заключенных какие-то сведения о других делах, даже не по которым они сидят, а по каким другим делам.
This is where the investigators try to extract information about different cases, not about the cases necessarily for which those people are being punished, but other cases.
Используя самые жестокие пытки, свидетельств таких сотни писем, которые мы получаем как от заключенных, так от родственников, так и после того, как они вышли на свободу заключенные.
And they use the cruelest methods, judging by the letters which we receive, not just from the prisoners, but from their relatives.
Вот, например, существует СИЗО номер 1 Иркутска. Я сейчас вот очень много занимаюсь этим.
For example, there's SIZO, or Следственный isolator, number 1 in Irkutsk. Там
зафиксировано около там, от 10 до 20 убийств. Там некоторые, все они идут как самоубийства заключенных, оформляются.
There are 10 to 20 murders, but they are all qualified as suicides.
И прямые требования расследовать и какая-то информация даже о том, что они были убиты, абсолютно прокуратурой не рассматривается.
And the prosecutor will not respond to demands that they be investigated.
И мы получаем чудовищные по своему цинизму ответы из прокуратуры, из Следственного комитета.
We receive monstrously cynical answers from the prosecutor.
О том, что этот заключенный покончил жизнь самоубийством. Например, он стал биться головой о железную дверь, а потом, чтобы, значит, окончательно уже себя убить, потом стал биться головой о, значит, о пол и убил себя.
They will say that a given prisoner began to beat his head against the metal bars of the cell and then to beat his head on the floor, and that will be their explanation for his.
И такие вот десятки таких случаев, понимаете, в разных пыточных колониях. То есть принципиально не расследуется, то есть система не работает по расследованию таких убийств. И в докладе, вот, который я привел, там это все докладывается.
And
Теперь,
there's information about this in the materials that I've brought.
ну и совсем, вот я немножко превышаю время свое, да?
Я думаю,
Можно
закончить,
чуть-чуть,
да.
можно. Вот теперь я хотел сказать, вот, а чем же мы почему мы все не ушли в отставку? И чем же мы занимаемся на фоне вот этого печального...
Given this situation, why haven't we retired and given up?
Ну, во-первых, мы иногда добиваемся расследований и все-таки наказания людей, иногда добиваемся, когда это, и даже когда это убийство, но очень редко, но когда, так сказать, когда это не пыточная зона, когда это можно действительно проверить, то тогда мы добиваемся успеха и защищаем просто обычных людей. И у нас много успехов здесь, сотни тысяч людей мы помогли.
When it's not a question of one of these torture zones, it's a question of an ordinary person, sometimes we have some success.
И мы какая-то отдушина такая. Вот люди обращаются к нам, а потом в Европейский суд по правам человека.
People appeal to us, and then to the European Court.
Но я не хочу приводить примеры, когда мы добиваемся успеха, это более банально, и мне кажется, это неинтересно.
I won't go into the successes now, but they do exist.
Ну вот один из примеров я могу привести, чтобы понимать, насколько широко работают правозащитные организации.
One example I will give you.
Вот, например, мы создали, вот мое движение за права человека создало отдельное как бы движение по защите прав обычных вот людей с права на жилье. Потому что у нас идет реформа жилищно-коммунального хозяйства, и там много нарушений.
All right, we created a bureau to defend the right of people to housing. And right now there are tremendous abuses in this area.
И мы обучаем людей, как взять в управление дом, как самым элементом, самым началом демократии, скажем так, как демократии низовой, самоуправления. И они к нам приходят, консультируются, и мы помогаем им это делать.
We give advice on how to, в смысле, что как...
управлять домом, вот, собственники жилья. Вот они собственники квартиры, а потом надо дом управлять. И у нас есть законодательство. Это им мешают, потому что чиновники мешают управлять домом. Территорией, кварталом.
Я понял.
Это большие деньги.
Yeah, that when we try to show apartment owners how they can, what their rights are in the building in which they live, and how to exercise those rights.
Вот. А теперь я перейду к той политической сфере, в которой мы сейчас работаем. Понимая, что принципиально решить нельзя, мы вот создали правозащитный совет России.
So I'm now going to just tell you a little bit about our strategy, the steps we've taken in creating this Council on Human Rights.
И мы поставили задачу максимально повлиять на выборы, которые будут выборы в парламент в декабре этого года.
We're going to attempt to influence the December elections to the greatest extent possible.
И вот первое мы что сделали, провели международную конференцию в России, пригласив несколько депутатов Европарламента и поставили требования, с которыми выборы можно было бы считать легитимными. Если эти требования не будут выполнены.
We've invited some parliamentarians from various European parliaments, and we're trying to establish criteria according to which these elections can be considered legitimate.
И требования такие, что были зарегистрированы партии, которые не регистрируют.
That parties that the authorities don't want to register be registered.
Есть партия левая, Ротфронт, есть партия правая, которая сейчас пойдет на регистрацию. Это партия Народной Свободы, где объединились все либералы.
There's the left front. There's the a right-wing party, party of the People's Freedom.
Есть первое. Второе, надо убрать цензуру с центральных каналов телевидения для оппозиции.
You have to remove the censorship from the central television for the opposition.
Надо разрешить блоки на выборах для того, чтобы можно было блокироваться мелким партиям. У нас запрещены блоки, политические блоки на выборах.
You have to allow small parties to form electoral blocks.
И мы говорим, что если это не будет... И мы направили все эти предложения президенту. И мы говорим,
we've sent all of these ideas to the president.
И мы говорим заранее, что если это не будет сделано, значит выборы не будут легитимны. Мы написали письмо международным...
We said that if this is not done, then the elections won't be legitimate.
И мы сделали обращение в международные структуры и сказали, что вот если это не будет сделано вот в ближайшее время, значит заведомо выборы нелегитимны.
If this isn't done in the near future, then it's intentional. Then the elections are deliberately illegitimate.
И тогда нечего наблюдать за этими выборами. Что толку, когда вы будете во время выборов наблюдать? Без толку. Потому что оппозиция не будет допущена к этим выборам. И мне кажется, вот на это письмо надо, чтобы обратили внимание на Западе, так сказать. И оно раздается, оно есть в той раздаче, которую я делаю. И мы, это первое. Второе, мы стали вести агитацию, начали объединять людей, разные, причем спектры левых и правых, против монополии партии «Единая Россия на власть».
We're trying to organize people against the monopoly of the party United Russia. The political monopoly of United Russia.
Это похоже на ту кампанию, которая была в начале 90-х годов, когда все объединялись против монополии КПСС на власть.
This recalls the unification of all the forces in the beginning of the 90s against the monopoly on power of the Communist Party.
Таким образом, мы создали как бы нейтральную площадку и надеемся, что это будет наиболее многочисленная аудитория.
And we hoped in this way to create a neutral kind of meeting point for all opposition forces.
И вот первый, сейчас заканчиваю, да. И первый такой митинг, концерт-митинг будет 17 мая. Вот
The first meeting will be on May 17th.
И можно понаблюдать, сколько людей это придет.
We'll see who comes.
Thank you, Mash. Я готов ответить. Если вопросы будут, то да.
And now, if there are questions from the members of the audience, why don't just raise your hands if you have questions for Lev Ilan? Yes, absolutely. Show yourself.
I won't do it in Russian because
I'll translate for you.
My question is as follows. You mentioned a fairly both as an initiator of reform and as an impediment to it. Which do you think he actually is? Is he part of the problem or part of the solution?
Lev, как можно охарактеризовать Медведева? Он часть проблемы или часть решения проблемы?
Я отвечу так, он и то, и другое. Но, конечно, в большей степени проблема, конечно.
He's, for the most part of the problem, but he's both.
Но если иметь в виду вторую, более важную проблему, это Путин, то тогда, так сказать, к сожалению, я только уклончиво так отчасти отвечаю.
Putin более важный.
Более важная проблема, конечно.
But there's a more serious problem with Putin.
Нет, здесь вот, чуть еще добавлю одну фразу. Дело не в Медведеве и Путине. Сейчас можно сказать определенно, что есть раскол политических, вот не только оппозиция против, так сказать, все фиксирует, все эти факты, которые я говорил, но и большая группа в политическом классе, скажем, политической элите.
It's clear that there's a split not only in the opposition, but in the political class.
И процесс зашел достаточно далеко, так, чтобы им потом вернуться назад к Путину уже нельзя будет, этим людям.
Чтобы Путин не может их принять.
Да, принять, да, назад.
Даже so the process has gone so far that Putin can't really take back those who have kind of split off from him, from his side. Okay, are there but the main problem apparently is Putin. Any other questions for Lev? Yes,
A question about an issue that was not brought up in this.
Okay.
I'm working on a project on memorials and the Council on Human Rights' role in de-Stalinization, and I recently
on what, the role in
de-Stalinization.
In de-Stalinization.
Yes, and I recently read that there was a new legislation introduced that would really get the ball rolling on that. And I was just wondering why now? Why is now the time that could be successful?
Она говорит, что она работает, она делает проект по поводу роли мемориала в десталинизации. И она понимает, что сейчас был какой-то важный шаг предпринят в этом направлении, либо в лице закона или что-то другое. Она хочет знать, почему сейчас такой прогресс, если в самом деле она существует.
Ну, конечно, вот сама идея десталинизации очень нужная и правильная. Борьба с тоталитарным сознанием, она важна.
Of course, the idea of de-Stalinization is extremely important, the fight against a totalitarian consciousness.
Но я должен сказать, что, возможно, как ни странно, может быть, это не главная проблема, которая сейчас, не самая актуальная проблема, которая сейчас есть перед выборами, тем более, и проблема возвращения Путина к власти.
This is not the most pressing problem right now, especially on the eve of the elections. На накануне выборов и возможно
возвращение Путина
and the possible return of Putin as president.
Это коротко так могу сказать.
This gentleman, yeah, please. We only have about 5 more minutes for questions.
My name is Mitchell Pullman. I worked last year as a long-term elections observer for the OSCE in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And I'm just wondering if Lev has any plans, Memorial has any plans to work with the OSCE on this project prior to the elections, project he's speaking about.
Which project do you mean?
Basically, well, he was talking about working before the elections to make the elections more transparent and the process more transparent.
Oh, okay. Lev, у вас есть идея работать с OSCE? I'm just trying to think what it is in Russian. ОБСЕ.
Ну, понятно.
ОБСЕ, да. Чтобы сделать эти выборы более прозрачными.
Мы, когда проводили эту конференцию, мы пригласили и представителей ОБСЕ, и Европейского парламента. Но Европейский парламент более независимая организация. Они к нам приехали. А из ОБСЕ нам никто не приехал.
When we did this project, we invited both the OBSE and the representatives of both organizations, European Parliament and OBSE, and the people from the OBSE didn't come. They are not as independent as the members of the European Parliament.
Но резолюции нашей конференции мы направили, конечно, в ОБСЕ тоже.
But of course we sent the resolution of our conference to the OBSE. And we have time only for one more question. This gentleman?
Robert Friedman, Johns Hopkins. As the elections draw near, are you planning to work with any of the political parties to get your platform pushed ahead a little bit, at least publicized, before the election?
Вы собираетесь работать с одной из политических партий, чтобы как-то привлечь внимание к вашей программе?
Во-первых, вот я, когда представлялся, я забыл сказать, может быть, ну и может быть это и правильно, что я являюсь руководителем одной из политического движения, движения «Солидарность». Я вхожу в руководство.
Lev is a member of the leadership of the political movement Solidarity, or Solidarnost.
Но моя главная работа, конечно, правозащитная.
But his main activity is
и вот создавая вот эту, мы считаем важно, что вот та площадка, которую мы создали вместе с правозащитниками, нейтральная, и она опирается как на левых и правых.
We hope that we're deliberately seeking to create this a neutral area that can appeal to both the left and the right.
И Солидарность поддержал нашу инициативу. Есть решение Солидарности, что оно участвует вместе с нами в этих акциях. Вот 17 мая там будут агитировать и Солидарность.
They will participate with us.
Но это главное, против монополии единой в России на власти.
But the important thing is that we're against the monopoly of United Russia in power. This is what draws everyone together and unites everyone.
Я просто еще одну фразу-то скажу. Вот я говорил много о ситуации, отвечал на вопросы, но а что вот могла бы, вот что мы хотели бы от международной общественности там, или, допустим, от власти Соединенных Штатов. Вот главное, что вот в Соединенных Штатах это сейчас обсуждается закон сенатора Кардина, да? И этот закон надо, чтобы обязательно был принят, это очень важно. И важно, чтобы он был принят в такой формулировке, чтобы список чиновников был открытым. Вот есть список чиновников в деле Магнитского, он уже канонизирован, он туда войдет, скорее всего. Прямо перечислены фамилии.
As far as what the United States should do, there's a bill that has been introduced by Senator Cardin, and it's which would это который мешает коррумпированных русских чиновников сюда приехать, и which bans corrupt and criminal Russian leaders and officials from coming to this country. And Lev says the important thing is that the list of such people should be made public.
Должен появиться механизм, и он, может быть, должен быть упомянут в этом законе, что в дальнейшем, допустим, Хельсинская комиссия Конгресса, которая существует, да, она бы определяла другие фамилии, которые будут регулярно появляться. Я могу назвать, например, дело сенатора Изместьева, который занимается правозащитники. Там есть ряд фамилий. Есть другие дела, по которым уже им есть фамилии, но они должны, конечно, изучаться, должно тщательно делаться. Но эти фамилии, наверное, до принятия этого закона не должны называться, потому что сенаторы будут отвергать. Вот одно дело, те фамилии, которые появились уже в деле Магнитского, там как бы известные очень, канонизированные, скажем так. А любые новые фамилии будут отталкивать сенатора. Но надо, чтобы был открытый список. Это очень важно.
Basically, he's calling for a list of those people who are banned to be available generally to Russia and, of course, to Russians and to Americans as well.
И хотелось бы, чтобы был поддержан вот наше обращение по поводу выборов. Вот прямо сейчас
and we are also seeking support for our
появилось заявление Госдепа, может быть, Конгресса.
Support for our appeal regarding the elections
о заведомой нелегитимности выборов.
And so that we get international support for the idea that elections which don't meet these criteria are intentionally illegitimate, intentionally unfair. Okay, well, thanks, Lev. Thank you very much for your. Okay. And okay, now we're going to discuss the rule of law in Russia, and our panelists include once they take their seats. Pavel? Lisa, maybe you can just sit with Levin and...
You're okay?
Yeah, have a seat. Have a seat. These, I think, all right, let's see what we have. No, these were these prepared or not? Well, one for me is there.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Okay, Pasha?
And one for me as well.
So you know what? I'll stick here.
No, I need. Yeah, go ahead, but I need biographical information about the. Oh. Okay. And what about you, Pavel? What besides? What? Yeah, go ahead.
I can introduce myself.
All right, we're taking a short break, and then we're going to start again. Where shall I sit? But I guess here.
We need to find.
And Ariel will be here. Here. Okay. That is here. Okay. Let's take a few minutes. And you'll translate for.
Spontaneous break.
What?
There's a spontaneous
What
break.
is this?
I don't know. Somebody. They brought something on the sheet with the pineapple speakers.
Oh, here's all this.
You got it?
I don't know what this is doing here and who it goes to.
Maybe it is, what's his name? Left.
Lev? Это вам принадлежит, да? Okay. Okay. I would like to introduce our first panel. The members of our panel are known to many of you. We will be discussing the rule of law in Russia, and insofar as the internal situation in Russia is not as visible to the American public as the statements of Russian authorities, we're in effect probing the soul of the country to a certain extent. We have participants who are well prepared to do that. They include Ariel Cohen, who's a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation and for many years an expert and commentator on Russian affairs, both in the English language and Russian language media. Pavel Ivlev, Pavel, the director of the Institute of Modern Russia, who was a practicing lawyer in Russia in the 1990s and deeply involved in the Kharkovsky-Lebedev case. And William Pomerantz, the deputy director of the Kennan Institute and former teacher and professor of Russian history at Georgetown University. It's Russian history, is it not?
I actually taught Russian law.
Russian law. Well, that's also an aspect of Russian history. And Ariel, I'm going to ask you to speak first, and we'll try to keep our remarks to 15 minutes for each speaker, so that we'll have plenty of time afterward for questions.
Thank you, David, and thank you, the Hudson Institute, for organizing this important event. It is important because when we speak about the reset between the United States and Russia, the rule of law, protection of property rights and human rights are often neglected. It is not a first-tier issue when we are talking about missile defense and the START agreement and the transit to Afghanistan, which are all legitimate and important issues. But I do believe that since the second half of the 20th century, maybe third and fourth quarters of the 20th century, human rights and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, protection of property rights and investor rights have become part of the package. You may not have heard about a massive investigation that is ongoing in Moscow and Moscow Oblast, Moscow region now, about underground casinos. It is not something U.S. media covers very much. But what is amazing in the investigation about the underground casinos is how the linkage of legislation and law enforcement create the environment that criminalizes activity that earlier was illegal activity. First, they passed a law that criminalized gambling. Gambling was legal in Moscow for 15 years. So they're pushing all this gambling in the underground. And then the investigation of the Russian media coverage of the investigation demonstrates that the krysha, the protection that was provided for these underground casinos came from, guess what? The Interior Ministry, the police, possibly the FSB, and the prosecutor's office. So you have, in this one example, a model of a linkage, of a merger, of symbiosis of law enforcement and illegal activity that undermines the very notion of the rule of law. If the cops are the criminals, who is going to watch the cops? I'm talking about this because in the 90s, I was a World Bank consultant on the legal reform. And one of the things we did in the legal reform is using skills I obtained with Radio Liberty audience and opinion research. We did focus groups and polling. Thank you, Gene, for teaching me all that. We used these polling tools to measure the levels of trust and support of the Russian public towards the law enforcement, the prosecutor's office, the police, etc., the courts. And at that period, this was 96, 7, 8, the polling was consistently between 70 and 80% of mistrust and only 20% of less of trust of law enforcement, courts, etc. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, today it's even worse. And it's pretty consistent. Every poll you find demonstrates that less than 20% trust the law enforcement and the court system. And as Lev Ponomarev mentioned, President Medvedev is the first one to hammer the issue of the failure of the rule of law and of the court system. What Medvedev is doing, I think, is supervising a musical chair game. I have a number of reports here that the former head of the criminal investigation department of the Moscow police was promoted, General Viktor Golovanov was promoted to be the head of police. They changed the name of militia to police. I think they're going to change the uniforms. But that by itself does not eliminate these tragic examples of the judges and the law enforcement officials, generals, colonels, etc., being involved in the worst types of the violation of the law. Here's a report about 4 generals of police being fired by Medvedev. Don't have a date of it, but it's very, very recent. The deputy head of the Moscow Police District is fired. The investigator committee of the prosecution, 9 of these heads of these committees were removed, but we don't see the results, not yet. And maybe as long as the ties of corruption bind the top officials, this is not going to change. Sometimes it's really, really tragic and horrible. Some of you may know the name of Anton Nosik. Anton Nosik is one of the founders of the Russian internet, a towering figure in the Russian online community. In his recent blog from 3 days ago, Anton is writing about how judges judge in cases of pedophilia. And he brings 3 cases from St. Petersburg, a recidivist, meaning a repeat offender of pedophilia, got 8 months of a penal colony. A banker was let go, and an electrician who was involved in horrible things, I just don't want to repeat them, was given a suspended sentence. Whereas pedophiles are let go, and Anton Nosik explains that this happens because the judges take bribes. People like Sergei Magnitsky died in jail. People like Khodorkovsky got the second sentence now, and his business partner, Platon Lebedev. There are reports on top of reports. Indem, a famous organization that studies corruption in Russia, chaired by Georgy Satarov, the former Yeltsin aide, comes with massive reports on corruption in Russia. The cases of judges who speak against corruption in the legal system are numerous cases where judges are fired. A judge by the name of Alexander Melikov fired in 2004. Judge Kudeshkina was fired in 2003. Recently, the press secretary of the court that sentenced Khodorkovsky for the second term came out and accused the judge of being handed the sentence from the upper level court. Well, guess what? On the 17th, I believe, of May, the same upper level court is going to hear an appeal on the sentence that court wrote. So guess what is going to happen with that appeal? Veniamin Yakovlev, the former, I believe he was the former chairman of the Supreme Arbitration Court, said, quote, "It would be incorrect to state that the legal system is fully free of corruption," unquote. And that's a very cautious statement by the judge. Judge Zorkin, not a big proponent of democracy, said, quote, "Bribery in courts became one of the largest markets of corruption in Russia." And I can continue with that. Now, something may be changing, and that is that just recently, some of the people who are suspected in involvement in the Magnitsky case, their assets in Switzerland were frozen. It's a tax official and her husband, and their assets reportedly were frozen in Switzerland. This is a woman by the name of Olga Stepanova. And we're talking millions and millions of euros worth of assets. Lev Ponomaryov said that the Magnitsky case generated a legislative initiative here in town on the House side with Congressman McDonald, and that initiative is discussed by the Senate. Clearly, as you heard from Lev, and as you know from research, violations of individual rights, of property rights, are not limited to Sergei Magnitsky or to the case of Hermitage. UCOS is one example where billions of dollars of assets were ostensibly illegally nationalized without compensation, and people thrown to jail. Not just Khodorkovsky and Lebedev that you hear about, but the lawyers that work for UCOS and other UCOS business people and officials. In many other cases, people were driven to exile. prominent business owners, less prominent people were thrown to jail. So it's a massive event. And if we are to proceed with this reset policy, if we are to improve our relations with Russia, which has improvement of relations with Russia definitely has its advantages for U.S. national interest, the issue of the rule of law and property rights must be part of the discussion. And probably the most important part of the discussion these days in Washington is what to do about the Jackson-Vanik legislation, which was created for a different country, a country that no longer exists, USSR, for an issue, the immigration of Soviet Jews, that also doesn't exist anymore. But there's a strong sentiment on the Hill that we need to link this abuse of human rights and property rights with our trade relations. And the idea that the Magnitsky legislation symbolizes, the idea is that those officials who are involved in abuse, in destroying people's lives or destroying companies, those officials should pay the price, at least on the level of not being allowed to visit the United States. They don't have a constitutional right of visiting the United States. And in a couple of Heritage Foundation publications in 09 and 10, we recommended that international law enforcement and intelligence services can and should be instructed to take a good look at criminal and money laundering activities of those in the former Soviet Union who are involved in bribery, corruption, massive violation of human rights, etc. And we're talking about billions, if not tens of billions of dollars squirreled overseas. So this is not just one's dacha somewhere in Slovenia. Yes. Okay. We're talking about massive real estate holdings, banking holdings, corporate holdings, etc. So I agree with Ponomarev. The lists, in whichever form they are legislated, should be open to amendment, whether it's this Helsinki Commission or other branches of Congress or of the executive branch. We will leave it to the legislators. But this is one thing that senior Russian officials care about, is their ability to travel and their ability to have access to their holding overseas. We also need to support those like Lev Ponomarev, like other crusaders against corruption. For example, Alexei Navalny, a famous blogger, and others, who are focusing in very, very harsh conditions on corruption and the abuse of law in Russia. And yes, President Medvedev and people around him at times make good statements. It is our job here to hold their feet to the fire, to make sure that their rhetoric is translated to action, and we will be happy to help. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ariel. And now, Pavel.
Thank you. Yes, good afternoon and happy Victory Day to everybody.
Yes.
Here, here.
For those of you who don't know, it's the 9th of May today, this anniversary of the end of the victory, at least in Europe, the Second World War.
It's a big day for all of us, I mean, in Russia. As David rightly introduced me, I'm a director of the Institute of Modern Russia, which is a really new nonprofit here in the United States. And I was forced to immigrate from Russia back in 2004, and I was a lawyer in Russia, a Russian lawyer, for, well, so far it is almost 20 years, so I was practicing law. So talking about the rule of law in Russia, I would like to start from quite a straight statement. There is no rule of law in the sense which we in the United States understand it. There's no rule of law in Russia, period. And there are many reasons for me to make such a bold statement, really. And the first one would be an interpretative one. How you will translate the words rule of law into Russian language? Верховенство закона, or законность, or правопорядок? I think most of you will say законность. And I think we'll be mistaken. Because from my point of view, законность in English, in simple words, will mean to obey an act of law, a written document adopted by Parliament. And is this the meaning of the term rule of law in English? I think not. So then, правопорядок, maybe closer, perhaps, but the meaning of Russian word право is much wider than of the word закон. So that is why as I said, it's closer to правопорядок than to законность. But the word право can also be translated into English as right. And that puts us into the rights area. And do Russians, I mean ordinary Russians, not the Russian authorities, have those rights? Let me stop my excursus into this linguistic charade and leave it to the specialist, just a lawyer. What is the impact of the absence of rule of law in Russia to U.S.-Russia relations? Well, it is, I believe, widespread. First, U.S. citizens traveling to Russia are unsafe and unprotected because the right for life is not respected in Russia. Look to the Russian Caucasus, where authorities killing people without any doubt and involvement of court system. The court system in Chechnya is simply not functioning, and it has been slowly substituted by Sharia justice, the Muslim justice. But if you think that the U.S. citizen more protected in Moscow, I believe not. Human life is not of a big value, even in Moscow. And one can easily die without emergency required medical treatment, and medics will easily can refuse to provide the emergency medical assistance for whatever reason. Not talking just about Magnitsky case, and it's again widespread. Medics will not provide you medical assistance. Police will not guard you from crime, and fire brigade will keep fire in your house in order to cover whatever they happen to steal from your house. And authorities will always protect these medics, police, or firemen. Even if someone brave will find, will be brave enough to start law case against these abusers. U.S. money invested into Russia are in the same danger. They are unsafe and unprotected. Since expropriation of UCAS in 2004, was that long ago, this expropriation gave a green light to the officials below Putin and Sechin to extort other businesses the same way. Russian authorities do it on a routine basis. As a result of UCA's expropriation, as it was reported to the U.S. Congress by experts in, I think, 2008, maybe 2007, U.S. investors lost $6 to $7 billion. As a result of extortion of just more recent example, as a result of extortion of the fishing business from Mr. Evgeny Gantmacher, U.S. national from Seattle, he lost everything. He only been able to save his life because he escaped from Russia, from Russian prosecutors who unjustly persecuted him. And American consumers lost the option to purchase inexpensive Kamchatka crab legs. They were widely available in our supermarkets. They're much less available now. Mr. Gantmacher was known as a crab king. He built this business. I think there's no need to go with more examples. You all know at least one for each of you. Mikhail Khodorkovsky recently wrote from jail, there are three major exports from Russia: oil, gas, and corruption. Do you think that U.S. market is well protected against dirty Russian money inflow? You don't need to go far from Washington, D.C. Various Kremlin-dependent organizations, such as Rosnano and Rosatom, offering funding for American NGOs, think tanks, PR specialists. What do they ask in exchange for their money? They want you to improve Russia's bad image in the West. Well, unfortunately, it is, in this case, image is just a reflection of today's Russian reality. I argue, let's not have illusions. These agents of Kremlin, the state-owned enterprises from Russia, they want you to be undisclosed agents of Kremlin, agents of Kremlin propaganda, and they're prepared to pay money for that. That means they want you to break US law. Is that not enough for Americans to care about the absence of rule of law in Russia? Let's try to be practical to answer that question. What shall be done by the US to bring the rule of law to Russia? Education, natural. But it is a long run with many obstacles on its way. First, Russians traditionally do not want to be educated by foreigners. We all know that. They better keep inventing their own bicycle. Russian leaders, authorities, need to be persuaded that it is in their interest to let Americans to educate Russian people. I believe it's not foreseeable with the current regime in Moscow. Quite opposite, for the simple reason. Putin is not interested in the rule of law. Then sanctions. Certainly, as it was discussed here already, the extended Magnitsky Act, let's put it that way, the Magnitsky Act, which will include not only the abusers of rights of Sergei Magnitsky, but many other abusers of human rights in Russia, and officials who abused human rights in Russia, that act will be prohibiting listed, so named by name, Russian officials from entering into holding assets in the U.S. That act is very much needed. And I hope we will all agree on that, in spite of the opposition coming from the U.S. Department of State. which obviously doesn't want to be responsible for maintaining this list, that act still is the thing which will pass through the U.S. Congress. What else? Aid to Russian liberal position? Definitely. And not only because a democratic country shall have political opposition and free elections. And United States obviously prefer Russia to be a democracy, not autocracy. But also because Putin's regime is not pro-rule of law. It is not interested in it, at least not interested. So it is in the interest, it is in the U.S. interest to support Russian Democrats in their efforts to return to power. Not because they are much pro-rule of law. They have their own skeletons in their closet. I believe that Russian opposition has to be supported simply because it is anti-Putin, who himself is the main obstacle to the rule of law in Russia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pavel. And now Bill Pomerantz, our last speaker. And then we will have, Bill, if you can keep it to about 15 minutes.
I'm trying to keep it 10.
Then we'll have time for questions and discussion with the members of the audience.
Well, thank you very much, and I'd like to thank the Hudson Institute for inviting me here today. I want to begin by basically agreeing with both my two previous speakers and with Lev Ponomaryov about the fundamental problems that exist with the rule of law. I really don't have any fundamental disagreements with them, and indeed I've made similar arguments in other venues myself. But I wanted to follow up on what Pavel was talking about at the end of his theme, and that was what is to be done. And I think that raises the question, really, is there anything within Russia that we can work with? Is there anything that has developed over the last 20 years that represents something that can be used to promote the rule of law? And so I've taken upon myself to do my best to identify 4 elements that are available, that can be seen as developments that promote, that can work towards the rule of law. And then I will, basically, though I agree with my fellow speakers about some of the fundamental problems, and I'll raise those at the end. So the first thing that I really want to emphasize and discuss, and this is something that Lev really raised in his talk, and that is the introduction of a constitutional jurisprudence over the last 20 years. If you look at the Soviet Union, and you look at how they handled major criminal dissident cases, what is revealing is that no court in the Soviet Union was empowered to declare a law unconstitutional. Instead, their sole obligation was to administer the law, so that when dissident lawyers were left to argue in those types of cases, was that no crime had occurred, that the elements of the crime had not been met, as opposed to arguing that the law itself was unconstitutional. Now, today you have a very different environment. Today, it is quite common when you read various cases in Russian law to see that lawyers are making a constitutional argument, that certain laws or government action violate a citizen's constitutional right. And we now have 20 years of jurisprudence from the Russian Constitutional Court articulating to a certain degree to what these rights actually are. Now, the court itself is not a perfect institution, and one can identify several occasions when it has caved into the executive branch. The most notable recent case was the decision a few years back, which basically upheld the government's decision to appoint governors in really clear violation to what is said in the Constitution. The Constitution talked about the rights of regions to independently set up organs of state power, yet it found a very creative way to support the Russian government. Nevertheless, you have the Constitutional Court, which has begun to explain what some of these rights are, and behind the Constitutional Court also stands the European Court of Human Rights. Again, a very interesting organization And their decision and the Convention of Human Rights also becomes a part of Russian law pursuant to the Russian Constitution. And when you read different constitutional court opinions, you'll find various references to the European Court of Human Rights. So what I would say is that the language of constitutional law and rights has now entered Russian jurisprudence and the legal lexicon. This does not mean that these rights are observed. And I want to emphasize that in many instances they're not. And that's where I agree with Pavel and with Ariel. It's very nice to talk about these theoretical rights, but in reality, in many instances, you can find where they're not observed. And I think what has become apparent that in Russia, these rights will not be granted, but they will have to be won. And they will have to be won by people like Lev Ponomaryov and others who are actively engaged in this struggle. And this struggle will take a long time. A second development I think that has occurred over the last 20 years, is an increase in what is commonly referred to as the demand of law. That if you look at the numbers, you will see a huge increase in the demand for law from, especially in civil cases. From 1997 to 2007, the number of civil cases in Russia increased by 132%, while the number of administrative cases increased by 195%. In less prominent cases, according to statistics, it's also apparent that Russian citizens can win cases brought against the state officials and government agencies. So at least in the area of civil law, I think, you have the emergence of Russians who are sophisticated consumers of law, who know when to sue, when not to sue, when to seek settlements, and so forth. Now, this is not true in the very prominent cases, as Ariel and Pavel have mentioned, obviously referring to something like the Magnitsky case. There is the phenomenon in Russian law that has now required a name of raiding, and that's basically attempts to use the legal system to get after property, businesses, money, or all three. So I think the problem is that even though you have an improvement in civil law, broadly speaking, since it really didn't exist 20 years ago, that is easily offset by a corruption that is very prevalent in criminal law. And as Lev mentioned, you have the 99% conviction rate dealing with criminal law. You also have the problem that criminal law really hasn't really reached the same level as civil law, in the sense that a lot of transactions that are allowed under the civil code are still criminalized under the criminal procedural code in Russia and the criminal code. So obviously you're not going to be able to have a rule of law system until those instances are addressed. And there are people trying to address them in Russia. A third issue that I just briefly want to raise is the issue of transparency. When I first went to Russia and tried to work with rule of law groups and civil society groups, I remember working with an environmental group, and basically they said, yes, we have a comprehensive, we have a copy of all the laws on the environment, and literally they had cut and pasted them out of newspapers and glued them into a scrapbook. Today you do have access to those laws. You can at least find them at bookstores if you go to the legal bookstores. If you go onto the web, you can probably find copies of the laws themselves on the web. You can also find constitutional court and arbitrage court decisions on the web. So you do have a greater amount of information about the law. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that Russia is moving to a system of precedent or that all these laws, again, are being followed exactly. Nevertheless, there is access to information. And the final point, which again follows off on Pavel's point, and that is education. If you walk into any private law firm in Moscow nowadays, you'll most likely have to deal with well-trained Russian lawyers with Western law degrees who have tremendous knowledge of international and domestic law. This cadre of lawyers really did not exist 20 years ago, and I also believe this is a resource that needs to be cultivated. Unfortunately, as we've learned, this is not a group that necessarily wants to be involved in politics. That's not the role of these types of corporate lawyers. And moreover, they're not very influential in Russia's legal circles that really count: the bureaucracy, the judiciary, and the procracy. So those are kind of four areas, four elements of what is to be done, elements that have emerged over the last 20 years that I think do represent a small beachhead that can be worked with. Again, they're up against just a wide assortment of of multiple and deep-rooted problems, many of which have been discussed already. I'll just rattle off the four that I think are the most important. The state, the Russian state, refuses to be subordinated to the law. Pavel's right to understand the notion of the rule of law and what it means to the Russian state for the better part of 3-4 centuries.
No, I'll maybe say a few. Yeah.
For the better part of 3 or 4 centuries, the rule of law has not been a central part of the state. The state has really refused to live under the law, and that remains a fundamental problem today. As several speakers mentioned, legal reform won't work without political reform. You can't have an independent judiciary without a free press and a multi-party system. The corruption issue, it has infiltrated the entire bureaucracy. And as one prominent deputy prime minister said when confronted with a problem, well, you just can't fire them all. But the problem is that deep, that really you don't, that it's a fundamental problem. And finally, something that I think should be raised is that continually the people who understand the importance of the rule of law in Russia are the ones who leave Russia, who are able to find someplace else to go, to emigrate to the West. They are well educated, they understand and appreciate the rule of law. So we find ourselves constantly having to re-educate and restart this problem, not to use the dreaded word restart. But the people who are most inclined to support the rule of law are the ones who are are consistently leaving the country. And it makes the ability to introduce the rule of law that much more difficult. So those are just, I don't want to be considered kind of pie in the sky, and I'm not overly optimistic, but I think those are the broad elements that one could work with, and then I'll open the floor to questions.
Okay, well, thank you to all of our speakers, and I will now take questions from the audience. I had one thought myself on the subject of rule of law, which is what I've noticed over many years in Russia, that a country without rule of law has frightened citizens. People have no sense that they are protected, that an encounter with the police, with officialdom, will necessarily be governed by any kind of rules. And under those circumstances, people have a built-in inclination to prefer authoritarian solutions. It's only a society which protects the individual and makes it clear to each of its citizens that he has rights that is capable ultimately of fostering a democratic culture. Now, I'm sure that there are some questions for the members of our panel, and so if you'll just raise your hands, we'll try to expand this to a more general discussion. Yes, please. But can you bring the microphone to that gentleman?
Thank you. My name is David Short, and the subject of the Jackson Vanik, which has been receiving a lot of attention recently here in Washington, was touched on. But I wonder if the panel could comment on the broader question of the WTO accession, because at least as I understand it, if Jackson Vanik is not repealed, but Russia goes ahead and becomes a member of the WTO, all it really means is the U.S. would not get the benefits of Russia would still get the benefits with all the other countries. And also this issue of corruption, it seems it doesn't just affect the U.S., it affects really the rest of the world or most of the countries of the rest of the world in their relations with Russia. And so my question is there any opportunity to leverage Russia's desire for WTO accession to try to get some improvement on the issue of corruption? Thank you.
Who would like to answer that question? Which of our panelists? Ariel? Pavel? Bill?
I can briefly take a crack at that. There clearly were several components to this question. Let me start from the end. Yes, if the legal minds agree that if U.S. does not lift Jackson Vanik, not only we will not take advantage of WTO accession of Russia if and when Russia gets such an accession, but U.S. firms will not have, more specifically, U.S. firms will not have access to arbitration under WTO rules, and that may put them at a disadvantage, while the Russian Federation may initiate proceedings against the U.S. For violating the equal treatment under WTO. Therefore, the solution that Lev Ponomarev and myself and I believe Pavel mentioned, which is the replacement of Jackson Vanik with specific sanctions, may satisfy the legislator. And that's what is bandied around these days and brought up in the House. What was the first part of your question? Yeah.
Session, thank you. Be leveraged. In other words, is it too late to say unless Russia shows some improvement on human rights and corruption and everything that's been discussed this morning, the rest of the members of the WTO will not agree to admit them?
Right. I'll let my colleagues do.
Right. My understanding is that because we're no longer in the bilateral round, we're in the multiple round of negotiations, it is very late to insert the issue of corruption into this process. So I do think that train has left the station. So unless we want to delay Russia's entry into try to raise at the last moment and further delay Russia's entry, which is already, 18 years and counting, 19 years and counting? A very long time and counting. I think that would really cause a lot of problems for U.S.-Russian relations. So I think at this stage it would be very difficult in the negotiations to raise the corruption issue by itself and have that stop Russia's accession.
Just
Pavel?
couple of words. See, it was confirmed in this city by high-level Russian members of Russian Duma, Konstantin Kosachev, head of Russian, what's the name, Foreign Relations Committee of the Russian Duma. He said that the balance in Russia currently is 50-50. 50% of politicians want Russia to go into WTO and 50 not. So basically, to get Russia into the WTO is in the interests of the world, and not much is in the, it is in the interest of Russia as a country, but as I said, many of influential Russians do not want it.
Can I just...
Yes, Ariel, go ahead.
Yeah, just to add, it really depends what kind of industry do you represent. Those industries that are plugged into the foreign markets and want to expand overseas are interested in WTO. Those industries who prioritize protectionism, such as agriculture, such as, I believe, timber, aluminum that got subsidy through artificially cheap prices for natural gas. Those industries that are protected through domestic subsidies, they strongly resist WTO. And then there was this dimension of prioritizing the trade zone with Kazakhstan and Belarus that Mr. Putin championed versus more openness to the outside world. Mr. Putin in 2009, when the WTO negotiations made a great leap forward, scuttled the accession by saying, we will accede to WTO only as a free trade zone with Kazakhstan and Belarus. And it took a couple of years to explain to the Russian side by WTO Secretariat that it'll take 30 years. So then they backtracked, and then we got where we got now after that scheme was abandoned.
Okay, are there any other questions? Yes.
Robert Friedman, what I've noticed in the last few months, for the first time, American leaders visiting Russia, starting with Biden but also with Gates, have started to talk about you, which they hadn't before. Do you think this is having any impact at all?
Which of our panel? Pavel, do you want to try to answer that?
Yeah, I'll try. First of all, it's very good that finally, after 2 years of reset, U.S. officials started to talk about human rights in Russia, thanks to Democrats.
Which Democrats?
I mean, Democrats, the leadership of this country. Well, they started, after 2 years, they started to talk about human rights. The impact, I mean, how it can influence Russian officials, they don't care. That's simple. The only reaction you may expect, they will be angry that someone from abroad, from the U.S., teaching them how to behave and what to do. This will be probably the only reaction of the current Russian regime.
Yes, please.
What would be effective about or bring it about?
Does anyone have some suggestions? Any of our?
Well, I think Ariel has raised some good points. I think in terms of direct action that the U.S. can take, I think the question of sanctions is an important one that should be on the table, especially if we proceed with WTO accession. I think in terms of human rights, the Kennan Institute last week held an all-day conference on the role of the European Court of Human Rights. And I think that is an institution that actually does have some teeth in terms of dealing with human rights in Russia. It is an imperfect institution. It takes a long time sometimes for cases to be resolved. Nevertheless, you have decisions that have called for penalties from the Russian Federation. They are substantial at times, raising more than 100,000 euros in certain cases. The Russian government has, in most cases, paid those fines to the individuals who have won adjudication in the European Court of Human Rights. The problem is, of course, that the appeals to the European Court are based really on the non-fulfillment of decisions in Russia. So it reflects some of the underlying problems in the Russian Federation. And whereas the court has told Russia that it needs to address these underlying conditions that lead to these huge number of cases to the European Court, Russia really hasn't addressed these underlying conditions. So it's a very imperfect institution, but it is an institution that does have some teeth, and approximately 20% of all cases before the European Court today are from Russia.
Are there, and very few of those cases are resolved in any other way except against the Russian government and government institutions. Anyone else have a question for our panelists?
Can I just,
Ariel, yeah, please.
Real quick, I think we're talking about one of the aspects of a 150-year-long debate inside the Russian elites about whether whether Russia is part of, back when, the West, or Western Europe, the Zapadniki, what Medvedev called the modernizers, and today part of the West broadly defined, including the United States, Japan, Canada, Australia, whatever, and the other part of the elite saying, no, we're not of the West, we're of Eurasia. We have a Eurasian vocation. As Putin said, China is a great friend of Russia, as the Chinese settlers slowly populate the Far East and Siberia. We are of Eurasian vocation as the number of Muslims is increasing. We are of Eurasian vocation when we don't have real multi-party democracy and free media. So this deep debate is what divides the Russian elite for 150 years, and the level of observance of the rule of law is just a symptom. It's one of the parts of that very, very serious divide, which expresses itself in many other ways, but this is not the topic of this conference and this conversation.
A thought occurred to me in response to Pavel's remark about Russia being an unsafe country for Americans. I recalled the case of an American citizen from Oklahoma. I think his first name was Sandy. In any case, he had gone to Russia to marry a woman that he had met. I don't know if it was through the internet or through some other means, and he had was going to adopt her daughter. They went to the theater on Dubrovka, which was showing Nordost, the big theatrical publication. At the time, it was seized by terrorists, and he was killed when the Russian authorities poured lethal gas into that theater. And his fiancée or widow, she has not been able to get any answers as to the components of that gas, why it was used under the circumstances, why he was killed. This is the kind of situation, there's an international interest in preventing the Russians from behaving in lawless ways in hostage situations, which can involve citizens of any country. Well, are there any further questions? If there aren't, we can take a brief break because we have another panel. Why don't we take a break for 10 minutes, and we will reform with new participants and a new topic. The new topic being Russia's foreign and domestic policies and the relation between the two. Yeah, let's for our panelists. Thank you. Thank you for participating.
I now feel a part of the panel.
Anytime. Yeah. I'm looking for a card for whoever is.
I see a bunch of different articles. I don't know if I've seen that.
I have it in my briefcase. If they have a copy here, I can. It's about 70 pages long.
I can track it down.
NYU law school.
It's going down.
Who's it by?
It's going down. The popularity is going down. Number one. And number two, if I had a control of CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN, and Fox all in one hand, like in Russia, I would get Charlie Manson elected governor.
So you think that there are enough Russian
Julia Lepkitskaya.
Okay, don't know.
She talks about the
and these are not necessarily identical. These are not necessarily identical electorates. There's some people who like Putin don't like Medvedev, and some people who like Medvedev don't like Putin. So that's a genius of that. Okay, we are missing a name tag, I think. Steve, you need no introduction, so they didn't prepare a tag for you. So.
That's okay. Mr. Anonymous.
What?
Mr. Anonymous.
Hard.
What's happening? You were at dinner last night. No, I wasn't. I didn't even get to town till 7:30.
Don, you're still with SICE, right? In terms of introduction. Just checking.
I'm with everybody. I'll talk about rule of law and foreign policy.
Yeah, U.S. policy.
All the way on the left, huh?
No, Steve Blank is to the left. As a Democrat.
Yeah.
So I tried.
My darndest. It's interesting, you know, TUI.
Yeah, against the he's with us.
I am.
He's with us in Russia. He's with us in Israel.
That was
This is what you.
Hey, so what I'm going to
Oh, I know. Yeah.
No. But I think this is a valid point. I mean, I'm happy to do whatever.
We're going to get the first little bat.
Yeah. Oh, that's lit. Good.
Doing our best. Do you have reception here?
I do. Zero like that.
To those in the society,
Part of the problem is
Okay, so now, now we're going to do things a bit differently. We're talking about foreign policy.
I'll be right back.
Okay. What? No, I get you. Yeah, I mean, now someone else will be the moderator. But I'm getting quite a workout today. In one way or another.
Anthony Berman, Ariel, David, and
Is our shoot coming to DC? I'll be in and out again, in and out of here.
Otherwise, he'll come on a different schedule. He'd love to have a chance to talk to him.
Well, I mean, you know, why don't you why don't well, I mean, we can get done. And no, I can ask Lee. I can. Oh, Liam, would you mind translating for Sandy? He wants to ask a question. Hello, Don.
How many times have we switched the panel?
What?
I was going to send you $100 after that. Credit cards.
$100?
Don't do that.
$100? That's all you were going to say.
That was probably.
$100?
I didn't believe it fully.
Are we ready to roll? Yeah, I mean, if it had happened to you, I would have sent 1,000.
But it didn't happen.
100.
I knew from the beginning.
Do you want me to call the class to order?
Yeah.
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Where's Steve? Steve Blank. Paging Dr.
Paging Dr. Steve Blank.
Well, you know, we're working on it.
Okay, who else?
We're making a documentary
Elon.
film about the fall of the
All right.
Soviet Union based on my first book.
Do you have a chair?
And I don't. I need a chair.
We need a chair. Over there. Chair?
What's his position? I forget.
That's what I've been doing at Radio Liberty.
Oh, yeah. Howard, any presidential?
Yeah, well, that I always
What?
suspected that one.
Can you scoot over to the left?
Oh, I don't know.
Fritz, I always was suspicious about that.
Can we
Yeah,
move down
we're good.
Elon?
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, can I call the last session of this conference to order, please? Okay. It is my distinct pleasure to moderate the last panel. Again, thank you to David Satter and to Hudson. David needs no introduction. He is a senior fellow at Hudson. and an author of many books. I first met him in 1983, and we worked together on some Radio Liberty projects. To his left, another veteran of Radio Liberty, Don Jensen. Don is currently with SAIS, Johns Hopkins, senior fellow focusing on Russia and doing other things. To his left, my good friend Elon Berman. Elon is Vice President of American Foreign Policy Council, like myself, a lapsed lawyer. And to his left, my other friend, Professor Stephen Blank. Steve is, of course, with the U.S. Army War College, one of the most prolific Russia watchers with great impact in U.S. Russian relations and defense issues. So without further ado, gentlemen, I think 10 to 12 minutes, if that's okay. We have 4 people, and then we'll have time for questions. So if you can police yourself, that'll be great. David?
Okay, I shall be the first? Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, we're discussing the foreign policy of Russia and its relationship to the domestic situation. And the connection, I think, is direct, because if you look at Russian foreign policy, the first thing that would strike, I think, an objective outside observer is its apparent irrationality. The Russians love to talk about geopolitics, and this is a very convenient way for them to avoid moral issues, and therefore everyone who considers himself sophisticated in Russia is constantly talking about balances of power and geopolitical interests. But if one were to look at Russia and look at its geopolitical interests, they clearly rest with the United States. Geopoliticians think not only in terms of intentions and apparent intentions, they also look at potentialities. And anyone who's inclined to think that way realistically would come to the conclusion that Russia needs a strong alliance with the West to balance the power, the growing power of China. Yet, such an observer would make a number of other observations as well. One of them is that with a large Muslim population, Russia does not need a nuclear-armed Muslim power on its border, particularly one that's ruled by religious fanatics who, even if they at the moment don't support the Islamic radicals within Russia's own borders, could do so at any time. Some people have pointed out that Iran, the country that I have in mind, is a Shia power and therefore presumably doesn't have an interest in supporting Sunni radicals. But it does so with great ease in the case of Hamas, and it could do so in the case of Islamic radicals in the North Caucasus. Similarly, it would seem to an objective observer that Russia's reaction to the stationing of American defensive missiles in Eastern Europe was absolutely hysterical and had no rational basis. After all, Russia's intercontinental ballistic missiles would attack the United States over the North Pole. They similarly cannot be, they're of a different speed and character than the kind of missiles that could be shot down by the ballistic missiles that were going to be placed in Poland and the Czech Republic, or the system that was going to be placed in those two countries. It was the radar in the Czech Republic and the missiles in Poland. And yet the Russian media treated this as a direct threat to Russian security itself, when it was only directed against a threat that Russia's foreign policy is deliberately fostering, the threat of an attack, a possible attack on Western Europe or on Western countries from a nuclear-armed Iran. So what then is the explanation for these seemingly irrational and nonsensical foreign policy positions? And I think that the answer is simply the interests of the small oligarchic group which rules Russia, a group which doesn't trust its own people, that is in fact alienated from its own people. A perfect example of this was provided just recently by the decision of so-called president, although I think that when we call him president, it should always be with inverted commas. Medvedev, his refusal to meet with the mothers of Beslan. Now, of course, people asked about this recent postponement of a long-planned meeting will say that he's not refusing to meet with them, he's only postponed the meeting. But the meeting took so long to set up, there was so much resistance to the idea of meeting with these women who saw their children burned alive in the hostage crisis in 2004, that a postponement on flimsy pretext is only a sign that that meeting is not going to take place, but they don't want the onus of having canceled it. What can one say about a government who, according to all available evidence, gave an order to open fire on a gymnasium full of hostages, half of whom were children, and used heavy weapons, including flamethrowers, grenade launchers, in that attack, with a horrendous, knowing in advance that the death toll would be horrendous, and then refuses to answer the legitimate questions of the relatives of the victims. Is that a government which represents its people, or is that a government which is afraid of its own people and represents only itself? I think the answer is obvious, and it's for this reason that we are likely to have enduring problems with Russia in terms of foreign policy. Fortunately, Russia is not the Soviet Union. I don't think that the Russian authorities in many ways are as clever as the people who ran the Soviet Union. The problem is that greed and corruption have a dulling effect on the intellect. They were much better off when they were deprived. But under these circumstances, Russia doesn't present the kind of global threat to the United States that the Soviet Union represented. But it's nonetheless a country which is fully capable of hindering the United States and hindering the Western world in important aspects of our attempts to provide for our own security. And therefore, it's really significant for the U.S. and for other Western countries to have a clear understanding of what's going on over there, simply in order to discourage those tendencies which work to our advantage, and to a much greater extent, of course, to the disadvantage of the Russian people. And there are a couple, in my view, there are a couple of principles that ought to guide American policy toward Russia, and which I think would make it possible for the United States to be more effective in pursuing its legitimate interests, and perhaps even more important, would make a contribution to the positive evolution of the internal situation in Russia, which would build up a critical quality in Russia, which is moral capital. It's often said that by pseudo-realists, they call themselves realists, of course, they don't call themselves pseudo-realists, but by people I consider to be pseudo-realists, that you have to deal with whatever is there, that these are the facts, you have to deal with them. Reality is what's there one day may be not there the next. What endures is the country, the culture, the civilization with which you have to make a connection. And that's a long-range project which involves ultimately the defense of values. So therefore, I think, first of all, it's not the United States should avoid needless gestures of goodwill in unnecessary and meaningless gestures, which only underline the extent to which we have little understanding for the realities of Russia. Second, we should bear in mind that the government of Russia does not necessarily, in the first instance, defend the interests of the country. It defends the interests of itself. And we should disabuse ourselves of the notion that the president of Russia and the president of the United States are in some sense friends. They can never be friends. Even if relations were better and the societies were different, they would still be defending the interests of their societies. And we should base our policies on a realistic pursuit of interests which don't compromise values. Shouldn't say things that aren't true, shouldn't make gestures that are unnecessary. And we should reserve to ourselves the right to react as world citizens to internal abuses in Russia. All of this will not affect critical questions of national interest. Russia will not sacrifice its ties to the West and the many advantages it gets from that relationship on the basis of justified criticism of defects that they know exist. We may can have some success in muting and neutralizing, to a degree, consistent anti-Western propaganda in Russia, and we would certainly have the effect of creating an impression on the part of Russians that on the Russian public, that we do stand for certain principles which we will defend regardless of temporary interests. All of these things, I think, offer a better way of dealing with the present Russian government and the present Russian internal system than that which is adapted under the rubric of what is, I think, inappropriately called a reset.
Thank you very much. And on time, Don.
Thank you. I'm trying to figure out who's a pseudo-realist and what's a realist.
Don't be a pseudo-realist. You're probably a realist.
Who are pseudo-realists and how they fight the working class?
I wanted to follow on with what David said by talking a little bit more about in a fair and balanced way, of course, about politics in Russia and its effect on foreign policy, because I think one of the troubles those of us with a values-oriented approach have to Russian politics is we need to explain why this matters. Why should we care? So I was reading an article last week by my former colleague Tom Graham, who talked just about how we could be strategic partners and so forth and so forth. And I very much agree with David that except for cooperation on specific issues of mutual interest, that would be very difficult. So first, the system itself, and I'm one of those, perhaps the only person in Washington who looks at Russia not primarily in terms of it being democratic or not, but primarily as a patrimonial system, that it is the blurring between money and power and personality is the fundamental dynamic of the system, not freedom or not there are many consequences that follow from that. David talked about some of them. Russia's certainly not the only patrimonial or neo-patrimonial country in the world. In fact, most are, as Richard Pipes would say, India, Italy, and some other places. But I think, since it is a major power, I think the dynamics inside Russia ought to be given considerably more attention. Corruption is not a threat to the system. Corruption is the system. And I always suggest people watch Michael Corleone in Godfather Part 2 if they want to see the dynamic, how Russia works. Personal politics, informal politics are critical and very important. The rule of law, of course, is very weak, although it is there in parts of the society. Public and private are, I think, as David suggested, blurred. There is very difficult to distinguish Russian national interests from what Gazprom or the ruling elite say are Russia's national interests, because the idea of money and power is so blended that you can't really tell, nor is there necessarily a difference between Gazprom, the personal interests of parts of the elite in Gazprom, and Gazprom as a lever in Russian foreign policy. Once we look at the system this way, I think a lot of apparently impenetrable Russian behavior becomes much more easy to understand. So the answer to the question, why should we care about domestic politics in Russia or the lack of the rule of law, for me is because it has a very direct impact on Russian international behavior. And that's what I would answer to people like Tom, who argue that it's somehow this black box acting according to national interests, calculated as we would. First, I think the country, the elite, because we are, as David said, talking about the elite, they are seeking to legitimate regime assets overseas, and the so-called reset is partly a need to stabilize their monetary and financial interests in Western banks in New York and even in places in Washington. Again, that's not to say it's the only dynamic, but for me it's the major one. Second, I would say not always, but often, there's a primacy of economic and business levers in foreign policy. And I just suggest you watch the ongoing soap opera of Ukraine's and Russia's gas relationship to see how that plays out. A third would be the factor of personal enrichment as an element in foreign policy, which I mentioned earlier. And by that, I don't mean that Putin or Medvedev or anybody else, Sasha Medvedev, consciously thinks he's violating the law when he acts as a public figure, to the extent that public and private are separated at all. I mean to say that they think they're entitled to it. And thus, we're talking about a large multinational corporation in many ways that operates and functions much more different than Western democracies. And so when we craft policies to deal with it, I think we ought to take these into account. Again, it doesn't mean I would oppose engagement. I certainly do not, if you read my commentaries. But I think we have to understand the dynamics of how Russia is ruled in order to craft foreign policy, even if we're seeking to improve relations as we are now, and to get advance our goals. Now, a couple of caveats about all of this. First of all is that Putin didn't invent this system. This is a system that existed in one form or another, as Ariel said in the first panel, before 2000, in fact, before 1991. Putin may have developed it and may have evolved and matured under him. But this patrimonial issue, this cultural issue, is very, very deeply ingrained in that society, and that makes changing behavior extremely more difficult. Second, I think we have come to a turning point in the Putin era, because there is largely an elite consensus that the system, the potential of the system, which was largely on the steroids of increased energy prices, now is increasingly under some question. And that's why we see the debate about the tandem. That's why we see the debate about the elections. That's why we see all the talk about modernization, as limited as it may be. So the domestic situation, the dynamics affect foreign policy behavior, as well as the traditional elements in Russian behavior, the tendency to see the West as an enemy, or at least as an adversary, the need for an adversary abroad to justify the elite rule at home, and so forth and so forth. The ambivalence toward the West, they want to put their money in Bank of New York, but they don't want to have too much control over internal assets and how America relates to the internal developments. So once we see in Russian behavior less as a democratic or not, but see it primarily as a patrimonial state, I think foreign policy objectives for the U.S. are much more easily derived. First of all, I would preface this by saying I'm not necessarily against reset or against the improvement of relations. I just think it's, as the economist Konstantin Sonin wrote about 2 weeks ago, it's a modest policy with modest rewards that's been oversold and has come at, I think, some considerable cost, especially in the near abroad. What does this mean for the U.S.? Because I'm about 8 minutes into my talk. I think, first of all, rather than preaching about human rights, and I got a tirade from a former Moscow colleague in the elite just the other day about this, rather than preaching about the human rights and how to improve it, although I do think it's important, rather than kind of obtrusively sticking our stick in the elite's eyes, which probably would have a counterproductive behavior. I think we ought to really push back firmly in ways that we haven't done as much as we might so far. First, I think there ought to be a much more vigorous prosecution of Russian corporate and international behavior on their oligarch-related companies. And if you look at the oligarchs around Putin right now, as the uncertainty about the 2012 situation unfolds, you see the so-called financiers around Putin, Bank Russia, Remchukov, and some of the others, looking around for international assets as though they are looking for a safe haven in case something untoward happens. But issues such as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, policies and laws such as RICO, I think ought to be more vigorously employed to limit Russian corporate behavior. If you look at European Union's attitude toward Gazprom and the energy sector in particular, you see a very lax enforcement of actually pretty good laws on the books. Laws such as anti-environmental issues, anti-environmental violations by companies such as Gazprom, laws such as those on the EU books that promote anti-monopolization practices. All of those things could be done and send a message to Russia that you cannot get what you want. You cannot have your yachts in the Mediterranean unless you behave according to the rule of law. And from that, above all, I think a lot of our other concerns follow quite naturally, especially on human rights. I think it will get, excuse me, it would eventually, with patience is always advised, it would eventually get a Russian response toward the kind of rule of law state, not quickly, but over time, that we all want to see happen. On a final word on the reset, which is to say, I do think we are seeing the momentum slowing. I think we have hyped it, but I do think that because of the different ways that both countries have in looking at the world, we're now struggling, as you've seen already, for reset part 2, whether it's tactical nuclear weapons or WTO or Jackson-Vanik, because there's not a lot you can talk about given these fundamental ways that both countries have of looking at the world and trying to compete still in many areas of the world, especially in the near abroad. Thank you.
Excellent. Elon.
Oh, thank you. This is a real treat. I've been dabbling a lot with the issue of radical Islam, so switching tacks at least partially to talk about Russia is a real treat for me. But truth be told, I have to say that when it comes to Russia's internal situation and how the rule of law affects Russian foreign policy, the issue of radical Islam is actually front and center with regard to what the Russian elites believe and how they translate the domestic threat into how they act abroad. I'll give you an example of what I mean. The Domodedovo airport suicide bombing in January did more than halt air traffic, did more than capture international headlines. What it actually did was it exposed, in pretty glaring fashion, a secret that Russia had been trying to keep from the international community for a long time. And that secret was that the Russian government, which had promised a speedy resolution to its own war on terror, what it has termed a war on terror, actually has very little idea of what to do about it. Russia has a huge problem, and it's getting bigger. And the response that the Russian government has marshaled with regard to the threat from radical Islam, not only in its hinterlands, but also increasingly in the center of Russia, says a great deal about what's coming next for Russian rule of law. This situation did not always obtain. If we think back to the collapse of the Soviet Union, we saw the fragmentation of a very large confederation that created 13 separate countries, half a dozen of them majority Muslim, over the span of 13 months or so. But the problem wasn't one of radical religion. The problem was one of ethnic separatism, of self-determination. And so the proper way to view at least the first Chechen war was not as a Russian struggle with radical Islam. It was a Russian struggle with further fragmentation, as they saw it, of the Russian Federation. You fast forward to the Second Chechen War, and you see a very different situation. You saw the rise of, there were a lot of dynamics involved, but you saw increasingly what has been a radical religious conflict. That much the Russian government says correctly when they say that there is a threat. What they tend to do, though, is to underplay how ineffective their strategy has been in confronting it. I spent a couple of weeks in the middle of December in central Russia, in the Volga region, to look at precisely this. Because we know what the situation looks like in the Caucasus, we know much less what it looks like in places like Tatarstan and Bashkortostan. And I had two major takeaways. The first is that the middle of December is not the proper place to go to, not the proper time to go to Tatarstan or Bashkortostan, generally, weather-wise. The second is that there is a rather dangerous dynamic beginning to evolve in the heart of Russia with regard to radical Islam and how the state treats it. Best microcosm of this can be found in Kazan, in the capital of Tatarstan, where on a very busy side street called Gazovaya Ulitsa, literally across the street from one another, there is the Russian Islamic University, which is the state, the regional higher learning institution for the moderate, historic Tatar strain of Islam that's supported by the state, that is endorsed by state-supported religious authorities, and which constitutes the way the Russian government would like religion to be expressed. And across the street is the largest Wahhabi Salafi mosque in the region, literally across the street. And professors at the university will tell you as they look over their shoulder that they don't have very much of an idea what to do about it. And this, I think, gets to the heart of the problem that the Russians are confronting. The Russian government has a fairly static, fairly stale interpretation of the Islamic religion, which they're promoting. They have an insurgent threat from a radical foreign interpretation of it, as promulgated by places like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, which is increasingly being imported. And the Russian authorities do not have a comprehensive answer to it. And I understand that some of you are looking at me and saying, why is this relevant? This is relevant because the Russian government approach to radical Islam writ large, as it manifested itself in the Caucasus, as it's now manifesting itself in the Volga region, and as it moves further east, has been, for lack of a word, exceedingly kinetic in nature. The Russian government spends a lot of time talking about the need to fight radical Islam with ideas, hearts and minds, all that stuff. But what they really fight it with is bullets. And they're losing. And because they're losing, because there is a real sense that in places, not only in the Caucasus, but increasingly in the heartland, in the Eurasian heartland, as the Russian Eurasianists would call it, there is an insurgent threat from a radical religion that they can't confront well. The impulse towards authoritarianism continues to grow. And Charles King and Rajan Menon talked about this in Foreign Affairs a few months ago. The failure of the Russian government to get its hands around the problem posed by radical Islam in Russia creates a tendency for greater authoritarianism at home, particularly because, first of all, the minority against whom they're orienting is getting bigger. This is an issue where demographics matters a great deal, and I don't have to tell all of you that the trend line in terms of Slavic demographics is increasingly bleak. So what the Kremlin confronts now is an atomized minority that's getting bigger, and which it does not really have an answer to. It's not engaging them, it's alienating them, as Beslan, as Nordula sort of really demonstrated. There's not a lot of interest on the part of the Kremlin to really embrace what is becoming an increasingly large, increasingly vocal minority. And in those places, what you're seeing is religious identification that's increasingly trumping affiliation to the state. And this is a very troubling dynamic that the Russian government is going to need to confront over the next several years. And the reason this matters for this larger discussion is because the way Russia treats its Muslim minority in the years ahead is going to be a very good microcosm of the character of the Russian state writ large. It's going to be a good example of the type of Kremlin we're going to have to deal with when we engage in the reset or otherwise. I share Don and David's skepticism at the reset. I think also been oversold, overhyped, underdelivered. But I think on the issue of thinking about how Russia fights this war of ideas with regard to radical Islam, this happens to be one of the very few, and there are very few, tactical issues where there is actually fertile ground for cooperation. One of the glaring problems that the Russians have had so far, and it goes to the heart of the corruption problem, to the heart of the sort of the lack of accountable government problem, is that all of the deputies that they've created regionally and in terms of the super regional envoys to deal with this problem are on the tape. If you look at the Russian regions, on average, certainly in the Caucasus, 60 to 80% of regional budgets are subsidized by the Kremlin, and which means that the Kremlin is essentially feeding the same problem that they're trying to combat. That money gets siphoned off on gray and black markets. That money creates alternative industries. That money fuels the conflict. And what you're seeing in Moscow is a recognition, at least for the first time, that this is a problem. But there's, as they say, there's many a slip between cup and lip. There's a lot of talk about the need for reform, the need to reform the system so you can actually do grassroots development, so you can win hearts and minds. There's not a lot of application to it. Which sort of brings me back, I think, to the reset. I was actually in Moscow the day the Senate ratified New START here in the United States. And I was struck by two things, and sort of the two observations the Russians, and I talked to a number of them, would give me from all walks of life. One was, we matter again. New START suggests that we matter again. America cares enough about us that it's going to sign this large, sweeping arms control accord. We're a great power once again, at least in the eyes of the United States. And the second was a domestic realization. If you remember the domestic context in which New START was signed, it came on the heels of 2 weeks of what they called ethnic protests in front of the Kremlin. As someone who was there during that entire time and drove by the Kremlin several times a day during different times of the day, I didn't see much by way of protests. But it was a really good sort of visual and mnemonic device that they used to demonstrate that, to set the predicate for greater force later with regard to ethnic minorities. And the message that we sent by signing New START at the time that we did was that domestic politics and how Russia relates to its minorities, that simply doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to the United States. I would make the argument that it matters a great deal, because if Russia descends further into this maelstrom of chaos that it is currently experiencing in the Caucasus and may soon experience elsewhere, including in the Russian heartland, the type of erratic behavior and, as David said, seemingly contradictory behavior that you have coming out of the Kremlin is only going to intensify. And so I think this may be a somewhat unorthodox approach to the whole issue of rule of law and governance, but I would make the case, at least, that the перегрузка, right, the reset.
Перезагрузка, that's the same.
No. I understand. I say it facetiously because if you guys remember the red button that Hillary Clinton presented to the Russian foreign minister in March of last year said перегрузка, which, incidentally, for all of those of you that know Russian, means overload. I would make the case.
Reload. But anyway, go.
Перегрузка is overload.
Перезагрузка is overload.
Right. All right. Right. So, anyway, sorry, my joke was too clever by half, but the point that I was trying to make was that that is going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy, because it's not just us that has a problem dealing with Russia on multiple levels. You know, we're talking with them in a strategic dialogue. We're also trying now to begin talking about human rights. This may be incompatible. I would make the argument that the Kremlin is heading in that direction as well, in which it has an increasing problem dealing with its own insurgent threat, and it impacts the rule of law there. So, stop there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I'd like to thank Ariel and David and Hudson for organizing this. My remarks do not reflect the opinion of the U.S. Army, the government, or the Defense Department. Russia has been a major actor in international security with a global impact for a long time now, and therefore what goes on in Russia, I think, is of vital significance, not just to us, but to a host of governments. And many of those governments actually, at least privately, have a pretty good idea of what's going on. I've been in a number of sessions with European intelligence officials and diplomats where they said outright that Russia is, and I pull no punches here, a mafia state. That's their term. It's the same term that you can find in the WikiLeaks, as reported by American diplomats back to the State Department. So everybody understands this is a criminalized regime. But that criminalization has enormous repercussions for international security, apart from what my colleagues have said about the domestic scene. And like Don, although I'm out of the Beltway, I've been saying for years that this is truly a patrimonial neo-czarist structure, and agree with him and with Pavel that there's no rule of law and so on. There are many ways in which this criminalization of the state affect not only Russian security but international security. And let me give you just some quick examples in the time we have. Bloomberg reported last year, on the basis of a European report, that 50% of the Russian GDP, which is about $1 trillion, is lost to corruption every year. So $500 million is unaccounted for. 30 to 50% of the defense budget, for example, we know from at least before 2008 also was unaccounted for and went up in corruption, probably still does, despite Serdyukov's efforts otherwise. What's more, this corruption is state-sponsored. There's an infamous interview in November 2007 with Oleg Schwartzman, stating proudly that he worked for Sechin in raiding corporations and forcing them to be turned over to state ownership or to social purposes. The outstanding examples of this are, of course, Yukos, and now Hermitage Capital, which is an international firm, not just a Russian firm, which is the Magnitsky affair. But beyond that, Shell Oil, Mitsui, Mitsubishi, other firms of this nature, smaller ones that we don't hear about very often, have been repeatedly victimized. And to crown it off, I think BP is going for the third time now into sailing into the hurricane. About 5 years ago, I spoke at Ariel's function on this, and a BP salesman told me, BP executive told me that I got it wrong, that Gazprom was serious in the negotiations, were going to be productive. This reminded me of Samuel Johnson.
That was a Kavicta, right?
Yeah, on Kavicta, right. Yeah. This was Samuel Johnson's expression that the second marriage represented the triumph of hope over experience. A third marriage, we have no idea what that means. But it's not just foreign corporations. I have an article coming out, which I can make available to anybody, where I talk about the energy business in Europe. The energy business in Europe, which is the mainstay on a day-to-day basis of Russian foreign policy and influence, is a totally corrupt affair. And if you check carefully what's going on from, I would suppose, even from Britain to Baltic and then to the Balkans, we see a fourfold effort linking together Russian energy companies, Russian embassies, Russian organized crime, and what the Russians call the special services, intelligence organizations, in a fourfold effort to obtain corporate lodgements in the commanding heights of European economies, to buy up media, to subvert political leaders and political parties, and to gain influence over critical sectors of the European economy. So the criminalization of the state is not something that stops at the Russian border, but rather is part of a deliberate strategy being used abroad. And as David pointed out, it also reflects the fact that for many of the Russian elite, private interest trumps national interest. We all know, for example, that in the oil business, if you build and the gas business, if you build a pipeline to one customer, the customer owns the pipeline, and you are stuck with what could eventually turn out to be a lemon. If you look at the Eastern Siberia Pacific Ocean pipeline that's been being built now, it was built exclusively to China. It is not going to be built anytime soon to Japan. First of all, I don't think Japan has the money now to invest after the terrible tragedies it's gone through. Secondly, the Russian government will not meet Japan halfway. Third, it is a loan from China to Rosneft and Transneft that got this done. But China was buying oil from the Russian railways. So essentially, Rosneft and Transneft stepped in to buy bypass the Russian railways and to make a handsome profit under the table, because we can be sure that Messrs. Sechin, Bogdanchikov, I think was the head of Transneft by then, all profited handsomely from this deal. $25 billion loan, and the oil is going to go to China. And they are already in court 6 months after the pipeline opened in disputes over price. So this is not working out as promised. At home, we see the rising criminalization of the army, expressed in Dedoshina and other examples of corruption. Despite Serdyukov's best efforts within the system, this has failed to change. And obviously, it's not going to change, especially as more money is being spent on defense these days and more opportunities for graft manifest themselves. Furthermore, there are reports in the energy business that Gazprom has been paying off President Berlusconi. Now, these have not been confirmed, so we can't take them to the bank. But it's not improbable, because the Russian energy business has been known for buying European politicians.
Take it to the bank.
He can take it to the bank.
Take it to the
Well,
bank.
he has bigger problems right now, like Mr. Schroeder. But once again, we see here the attempt to use crime to undermine the political institutions of sovereign states. Having talked to some officers who have returned from Afghanistan, the Russian government is justifiably alarmed about the drug trade coming out of Afghanistan. It keeps harping on NATO's failure to prosecute it. However, as they point out, this would not be so much of a problem if the Russian military and local government officials were not as corrupt as they are and facilitating the dissemination of narcotics through Russia. This is killing something like 30,000 people a year, mainly in the most productive age group, the 20 to 40 age group of Russia, and untold numbers of addicts beyond that. So here again, we see a major national security problem being exacerbated by the greed of officials. We are going to see very soon in New York the trial of Victor Bout. You may have forgotten about Victor Bout, the merchant of death. Mr. Bout was selling arms, clearly connected way up the tree in Russia. As a matter of fact, once he was arrested in Thailand, the Russian government pulled every string it could to get the Thais not to deport him to to expatriate him to the United States. They are terrified at what might come out in the trial. I would suggest that you all read the transcripts, not just the news reports, very carefully to get an idea of the linkages between illegal arms sales and the Russian government that Mr. Bout was involved in. We heard this afternoon about how Rosnano, Rosatom, and presumably other elements of the Russian government are trying to buy influence. I can attest from my personal experience that this is true because I've been approached. I suspect others have been as well. European Court of Human Rights, as a major article in the New York University Law School Journal points out, has been deciding cases after cases after cases against human rights violations and crime in Russia. But the Russian government has refused to take heed of these decisions. Although they have paid the penalties, they are not making the reforms necessary. We see also, in the case of espionage, if you remember last year, 10 Russian spies were rounded up. What they were doing is not entirely clear from the published accounts, but it does appear that one of their purposes here was to get close to American business and insert themselves into business circles in the United States, creating agents of influence and creating lodgements in American business for Russian intelligence and perhaps corporate money laundering as well. This would not be the first time this has happened. As some of you who have long memories remember, in 1998, there was a major scandal involving high-ranking members of the Russian government, none of whom was ever brought to justice, and the Bank of New York. That case has never been satisfactorily resolved either. A number of people at lower levels were tried and convicted, but we never found out what happened to the money. Finally, as well, we see growing repression in Russia. Lev Ponomaryov talked about the revival of the Gulag in a small way. We know that Mr. Putin, for example, has put political prisoners in what used to be called psikhushkas, psychiatric institutions. We heard about what goes on in the prisons and in the investigative isolators. We also know that Russia serves, as a recent study on Central Asian counterterrorism laws points out, as a reference group for Central Asia. And therefore, the Russian laws on the counterterrorism, the Russian laws on the internet, on restrictions on the media, all serve to one degree or another, as templates, models, for the repression of political opposition in Central Asia, which many of us believe can ultimately turn around and lead to an exacerbation or an aggravation of very tense internal situations there. Thus, Russian criminality, Russian corruption are the state. They have a decisive influence on international security from Europe to Asia and on Russian security, and therefore call into question the nature of what we are dealing with at home. The reset does not take the Russian domestic picture into account. Although recently Vice President Biden and Secretary Gates have spoken about human rights, it's necessary to speak more. Even as Pavel said, it makes the Russians angry. Although they may say they're not going to do anything about it, if there were a systematic and coherent and organized campaign blending together both public and private pressure, like the case of the Soviet Jewry movement a generation ago, it would get their attention, particularly as now they are increasingly desirous of foreign investment and of membership in the WTO. While we may not be able to use the WTO, we certainly can use the attraction of foreign investment. And we need to say to the Russians very simply, if you want foreign investment, we have some very simple conditions. No more Magnitsky cases, no more BP cases, no more Khodorkovsky cases, and you agree to accept the rule of law as applies to foreign investment and to investment by your own people in Russia. Because as we know from the history of the spread of human rights and of the rule of law and of democracy, it does begin with property rights. That is what the Magna Carta is all about. Doesn't mean that we're going to have a democratic revolution tomorrow in Russia. That doesn't happen overnight. It's a long process. It's going to be incomplete when it does happen, as was 1989 to 91. But unless we act now, we will see further entropy, further corruption, further criminality, and the blockage of real attempts at rapprochement with the West. The reset policy cannot and will not go further unless there is some attempt to deal, first of all, with regional security issues in Eurasia and with the linked issues of what is now called the values gap. Russian government has made it clear in many statements, as have its ambassadors, that they do not see the post-Soviet states as being truly sovereign, and they see them as fields for exploitation. If Russia wants a reset, if Russia wants foreign investment, if it wants to be a European state, then this attitude is going to have to be changed, and it can only be changed by pressure from the outside, applied both systematically and coherently. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you for the panel. Let's give the panel a hand. And now we have probably about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. Is there a hand? First question? If not, I'll
there is
make up. Oh, okay. Right here, if you can introduce yourself, please.
Sandy Saunders. In keeping with what several of the members of the panel were saying, any comments on the Russian claims to want to enter the WTO? Prime Minister admonishment to one of its officials about premature compliance with WTO requirements?
Yeah, the issue is not whether Russia complies with the WTO before it gets in, but after it gets in. I mean, the real problem right now is not going to be human rights. The real problem is Georgia. Because the last country that has to approve Russia's entry is Georgia. We're now in the multilateral round, as was pointed out. But the Georgians are going to demand take an extremely tough negotiating position, as they already have, and the Russians are already complaining about it. But those are issues that go beyond the scope of human rights and the rule of law. I'm afraid that train left the station. Now, Congress can act, as we've been discussing, but the issue is going to be whether or not we can make sure Russia complies when it's in there, because it is now trying to enforce its customs union with Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. That puts them in conflict, and the Ukrainian government said last week, we are not joining the customs union if we can't get into the EU and WTO. And Putin lost that argument, at least for now, when he went to Ukraine last month. So there's a lot of imponderables up in the air. but they're not connected to human rights.
Anybody else want to add? Yes, Don?
On WTO, I was at an event a few months ago at CSIS when someone said, why does the U.S. Oppose at the time U.S. Russian accession? And in fact, Putin accepted, I think, about 2004, as I recall. And there was considerable lobbying by Russian oligarchs against accession. And he had to sort that out, I think, before it went further again. And the second is Steve's absolutely correct point, is that the customs union, which is a vehicle for advancing Russian interests in the near abroad, which both Steve and I have talked about, has to be reconciled somehow. It's not a black and white cut price.
If I may, I have a question. Elon, you wanted to
Just
add something on WTO?
Yeah, a brief 2 seconds.
Yeah.
I think I'm a free marketeer, so I care less about what our administration says and more about what the market does with regard to Russian corruption and sort of the perception that Russia is going to be a responsible stakeholder. So the fact that over the last 7 weeks you've seen 6 major multinational banks pull out of Russia, right? You're talking about Barclays, you're talking about Morgan Stanley, you're talking about Banco Santander. I mean, that tells you everything you need to know about what international finance thinks Russia is going to behave like once it enters the WTO. And that, I think, should give us pause. It doesn't give the White House pause, unfortunately, because the White House, as I'm sure you saw, the Vice President had a piece in the International Herald Tribune talking about the fact that now sort of all is forgiven. We just want you to work on corruption, and this is one to grow on. Unfortunately, I think it's going to be much tougher to apply that standard and to ask Russia to actually change its behavior, its entrenched economic behavior, once it's in the WTO, than while it still needs something from us. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, well, clearly the stronger bargaining position is before the transaction or ascension to an international convention happened. We all know that. So clearly, if we want to extract concessions from Russia vis-a-vis WTO accession, this is the time to do it. I have a question to the panel, and that is with regards to the BP Rosneft deal. There was a report, I think, today that Mr. Dudley, the CEO of BP, met with Mr. Putin trying to save the deal. What does the panel think about the fact that some of the core assets of Rosneft that BP will be acquiring as a result of equity swap between them were the Yugansk Neftegaz assets, which were the core productive assets of Yukos, and as court after court in Europe adjudicated that these transactions, these acquisitions were not in full compliance with the law, there is at least an appearance of BP acquiring assets of questionable provenance. Do you have A, an opinion, and B, a recommendation to the U.S. government, because there were plenty of American investors in the Yukos case, as well as the British government? I talked to the Foreign Office people, and the way I interpreted what they said, and they were a little bit opaque in their formulations, but they distanced themselves from that decision, according to my understanding. But if you have any insights in that, that's quite interesting.
Well, I don't have insight into what was reported today, but it seems to me that Rosneft may want to get out from the possibility of legal action against it in European courts. But if BP does actually gain ownership over elements of what was Yukos, I would suggest that the U.S. government actually take them to court to recover for the stockholders who were expropriated. Because I think that BP is playing an extremely disingenuous role here. But it would also force Rosneft out into the open. I think that the only way that you get anywhere with the Russians as a general principle in these kinds of matters is that they have to understand that non-compliance carries a bigger cost than business as usual, which is the stealing and corruption and the graft. And that if they don't comply, it's going to cost them a lot more money. And I think the prospect of having Rosneft tied up in courts for years might actually increase their concentration on what's important.
I agree with that. The acquisition of Lugansk and Neftegas was particularly outrageous. And in fact, if it's acquired by BP, that might very well provide the means by which American shareholders in UCAS could recover some of their lost money.
Well, BP, to be fair, BP is not buying physically. There's no ownership transfer of Lugansk Neftegas assets from Rosneft to BP. There's an equity swap. So as
that
a
could
partial
be
owner,
interpreted by the court.
I'm not
as,
a corporate lawyer.
yeah.
I cannot possibly comment on that. But it will be a partial lawyer through the equity that it will hold in BP, according to my understanding.
There shouldn't be a lot of problems.
Professor Bob Frieden. Yeah, go ahead.
Just as an aside, it's also an extremely good barometer of where Sechin stands in the top right now, where Putin is essentially being asked to pick between competing oligarchs, and there are some signs that Sechin's position has been slipping a bit, although it's hard to tell. And relatedly, Medvedev's order to remove government ministers from corporate boards 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, whenever it was, people are watching Sechin's position very closely, although someone said he was still.
We have time.
Maybe two or three more.
Yeah. Okay. Let's take 3 now and see how we're doing. Fritz, and then Bob, and then the gentleman here. Over there, please.
Fritz Ehrmart here with a question for whoever. All of you have left the impression, but especially Steve, that the Russian export of its, let's call it business style, has achieved a degree and a momentum that it's just going to be practically impossible to reverse unless the U.S. and other, at least some other countries, Western European countries, launch a kind of, public, dramatic, and demonological purge, a witch hunt, to drive this back. And that's just not going to happen because, A, it would be politically incorrect, B, it would be counter to both strategic and PR interests involved in reset, and C, they've already got enough political clout through business connections to make sure it doesn't happen. Moreover, in a sense, it would be unfair because other countries export criminalized and corrupt business styles as well. Would you share this somewhat gloomy view? And let me go on to suggest that one of the consequences of this state of affairs is going to be much more significant infusion of Russian money into our political campaign. Remember the Roger Tomraz, Korzhakov, Borodin encounter in Milan?
2012 is right around the corner. So, gentlemen, we have, okay, so that's the first question, the gloomy view. Bob Friedman, second question, please.
Oil and natural gas question for anybody, 2 parts to it. One, I think the Russians may be in a bit more vulnerable position than has been mentioned. The very fact they had to make a deal with State Oil and do their boundary with Norway after blocking it for a very long time. The original deal with BP means they really understand they can't get the stuff, the oil and natural gas, without foreign help, number one. They're also obviously pursuing it in Iran. It's one of the reasons they won't give that up. That's number one. But number two, looking ahead a couple of years, the shale gas phenomenon in Europe, if it's developed, and it looks like it is going to be, it seems to me at least, going to have a major negative effect on Russian foreign policy because they're going to lose a lot of, foreign exchange.
Okay, natural gas, shale gas, and the gentleman here, and we're right. No.
the gentleman here. And we're really running out of time.
Yes.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Up as Estonian embassy. Well, somebody from speakers mentioned that foreign opponent is very good for consolidating power. And do you expect that Russian foreign policy, as let's say people in power are gearing up for presidential campaign, could become more aggressive toward neighbors? Or
Are they going to invade Estonia? No. Who would like to start with Fritz's question? And we're out of time, so please.
Very quickly.
Compact, yeah.
It's true that I think this business export, if you like, has reached a certain stage of self-sustainment. The problem is, Fritz, I think that you're being too negative because things change. As Bob pointed out, there are the dynamics of the energy industry are beginning to work against Russia in many ways, although they are trying to get into the shale and so forth. So what's more, the scope of this corruption and criminality has led to a situation of entropy in Russia. Despite their best efforts, they only grew 4% last year. They may think that's good, but if you see how much money was pumped into the economy, it's really inefficient. So I think that barring major reform, which is quite unlikely, that there will be sooner or later an economic crisis. I can't say when. And
just to thank everyone.